Okay, good afternoon. This is the first broadcast of Enterprise IT Innovation. My name is Matthew O'Keefe. I'm your host. I work in the database engineering group at Oracle, and I'm very fortunate to have several very interesting guests today, Tom Hudak and Randy Olinger. Randy is going to join us shortly. He's basically working through a few technical difficulties. So just to give you a little background, I decided to start this particular podcast, whatever you want to call it, a few months back because I was interested in talking to smart people like Tom and Randy, and there'll be a kind of a stream of similarly smart people who work in large enterprises and have operational duties, also R&D, go forward, make things happen kinds of duties, combination thereof. So they kind of see both aspects. And I personally have worked everything from school teacher at a university at the University of Minnesota, did a lot of research and teaching, did several software startups, including one that Tom was a wet behind the ears 17-year-old IT system admin who was actually really, really good and was a great addition to the group some years ago. And so he and I have kept in touch. And then Randy, I met when I was, after my startups, I ended up doing some consulting, then ended up at Hitachi Data Systems, which was and Randy's firm was a big customer, so we met there. So today, what I'd like to talk about, it's kind of a broad issue, but I'd like to, and I haven't really told Tom or Randy this topic, so shame on me, but bottom line is, I think when you look at innovation, so innovation is you do something different in a direction that increases something you're hopefully going to improve, will improve something in your life, right? So one person's innovation might be another person's degradation. But so when we say innovation, we mean something, maybe your applications run faster, or you develop new applications that are dramatically competitively different, or you increase operation efficiencies, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of the standard thing you think for enterprise IT. So typically this happens through a combination of stuff from firms like mine, big established firms that have been around a while, Microsoft, et cetera, and then other for IBM, et cetera, and then also the stream of startups. So you have venture funded startups, you have startups that are self-funded, et cetera. But that's kind of innovation comes in different directions. Sometimes it's open source, sometimes it's proprietary, whatever. So I think maybe let me maybe put the question out there. I think one of the biggest issues right now in IT is that there's a lot of two things. There's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of money involved. And typically when there's a lot of complexity and money involved, you have to be very wary of what the so-called kind of experts say. So you have to really make your own judgments and think carefully about what you're doing. So, but I think a lot of what happens is, is people follow what other folks are doing because they're sort of safety in crowds, if you will. And there's certainly something to that. But kind of maybe my first question to Tom is, how do you balance sort of what you're seeing out there is what's popular, what a lot of people are adopting, and how do you balance that against doing like kind of a step-by-step incremental evaluation that takes, hopefully doesn't take too long, doesn't cost too much, and then surrounded by some kind of decision-making process that lets you get to a good point. So yeah. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, it kind of goes back to the architecture approach of requirements gathering, right? Doing a good job of that. Generally what we're looking for, so we're being a big company with established presence in many different vendor spaces and in different markets for tools and new things. There's a tendency with big companies to, through procurement, kind of create a filter that is effectively, a way to steer things towards an existing capability, right? And it's not always based on requirements. It's sometimes just like, well, all right, those are nice to have things, but really your requirement is you just need a destination to send logs, or you just need an APM tool. And they're not going to consider why you might want to use a different APM tool without, or whatever the solution is, without a significant justification, and then it's treated as an investment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so once you make that investment, you pony up the money, there's a strong drive to get as much value out of that investment as possible. And that's why you see groups like procurement teams in large orgs tend to steer people towards the same products over and over. And I wouldn't say that stifles innovation or limits it necessarily, but there has to be another component to that side of the house, right? So if one side is about maximizing and leveraging existing investments in technology, tools, processes, and vendors, there needs to be an equal opposite side that is not focused on those things. It's focused on finding the differentiators, the things that really stand out, that are the compelling reasons, or provide significant value, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's, for any given thing, there's always inflection points that make one product or one tool or one vendor different or better than their competitors, right? Everybody's got their thing that they're trying to sell.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're looking at, trying to bring in new tools, and my team actually has a process for this new technology evaluation. So it's kind of like an emerging technology group. We're partnering up with our procurement group to better understand why we would want to do something, to convey to them why we would want to do something different than is the standard solution offered by the procurement group, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than buy licenses for the existing thing, why do we want to bring in the new thing?
Mm-hmm.
What do we plan to do with it? So, we've got a process of going through kind of creating an executive summary and weighing pros and cons, weighing the benefits of specific features or capabilities that we think add significant value or
Mm-hmm.
compound value versus just are nice to have things or add expense but don't really bring what they claim, right? Or what the marketing hype says, right?
Sure.
And then there's the process of okay, once you actually get your hands on the thing, is it all that it's been, marketed as? What common problem is, salespeople will tell you that their things can do anything, and a lot of times it comes down to the minutia and the detail.
Yeah.
Right? There's always that one critical element of, oh yeah, it would work great except for X, and if you can't meet X, then you can't take advantage of that thing, right? And a lot of times in a big organization, there's actually many factors. It's not just down to one, but there are points of integration that may not be supported, right? There are technologies in use around security that may not be supported, and all of a sudden what seems like a great thing can't be integrated with the other things that are in your stack or in your environment that are also critical,
right?
And so sometimes there's a need to isolate those things out and put them in their own sandbox space so that you can do a proper evaluation, but outside of the all the bells and whistles attached with all of our internal things, just to get a better idea of where you can get value from those new products, new innovations. And then, especially in healthcare, there's always significant concern around data, personal data, and healthcare data, right? So
Mm-hmm.
information about you as a person, your name, your address, your location, your birthday, but then also medical records are, critically important to protect.
Mm-hmm.
And we have lots of regulatory guidelines around that. So everything in healthcare is done through the lens of, is PII or PHI involved, exposed, readable, movable, who's allowed to do that, and then a lot of the contractual legal language around what happens if something were to get breached or get out of your doors, right? And in the hands of somebody who it's not intended for. So there's a lot of complexity around the actual process of identifying and procuring new innovative technologies. It's a lot easier to bring something in-house and totally close it in than it is to say leverage a SaaS tool, for example. Because at least if it's running on my server in my data center and it can't talk to the outside world, no matter what it has access to, it can't disseminate that out, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So those are some of the major concerns that we face when we're trying to bring on and evaluate new technologies. And I'm sure Randy's got some similar experiences working through the procurement process. And
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I've had some similar experiences, but I've come to the conclusion that um, you can't buy innovation. So we had
yes,
a emerging evaluation team a while ago, and it turned out they were just looking at products from vendors that were at least 5 years old in the industry, but certainly emerging to our big company, which just made me realize we were 10 years behind in our application
Yeah.
development or tool selection. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
but and that's not necessarily bad. Obviously, big organizations tend to move very slowly and very cautiously. They have
Hmm.
a lot to lose, but it's also incredibly difficult to innovate at a place like that because the nail that sticks up gets pounded down.
Hmm.
That's
hmm
old as dirt, and I don't think that's specific to the healthcare industry. I think that's it. It seems more common in the health insurance industry because it's just the history of it is mitigating risk. That's what insurance
yeah,
is.
yeah,
So there's a lot
Right.
of cultural things in companies that keep them from innovating. But certainly, the bigger you get, the older you get, and from a company point of view or as a person, the less likely you are to see that you're actually Blockbuster and Netflix is coming. So
Yeah.
that's probably the biggest
yeah.
risk to companies like us is we could be, the hottest thing in the world today and completely irrelevant tomorrow,
Well, it's
especially if
interesting.
we stop innovating.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like the innovator's dilemma, the guy that kind of the Harvard Business School professor who built the model of like disruptive technologies, what he did, his point was that big firms are really good at efficiently deploying capital based on kind of
Right.
previous sets of rules, and so they have all these rules about deploying capital, and in the meantime, there's this odd different business model based on completely different premises, but yet attacking the same market can kind of come along. And that's what's tough for big firms to see
It
and
is. I
react
mean,
to. Yeah.
here's the way it happens at our company is a few people get together and drink some beer and start having wacky ideas and learn about each other and say, wow, you're a pretty interesting person. We should do more. And they start maybe working together and they come up with some crazy ideas. And pretty soon they say, we should meet every week and expose these ideas to other people. So you have kind of a roughshod cowboy meeting every week or every 2 weeks or something. And it's really fun and you learn a ton and the acceleration is incredible. And then someone says, hey, we should have someone take notes, And so, oh, okay. It gets a little more formal. And then it's like, you know what? We want people to show up with some presentation materials because now we got 30 people coming. It's a pretty big investment in time and we should be very careful about how we're doing this.
Yeah.
And then pretty soon someone comes out with a standard template for the PowerPoint that's got to be given. At that point, the people who started have long gone. They haven't been there in months.
Yeah.
I've watched that a couple times too at two different companies. You kind of go through the cycle that they try to bring in innovation and then they try to codify here's how we're going to do innovation or
Right.
we're going to pigeonhole to this group, we're going to define this group as our advanced technology group or something like that, and at that point it's dead. I mean, it's great to be in that group while it's there, but eventually they're expected to make their TPS reports without the cover page,
Right.
and at that
So
point you're not innovating anymore, you're just funneling Gartner research into other teams.
so how do you break that cycle? I mean, how do you? Because I agree with you. That does
I don't know. I mean,
the
it's
process. Yeah.
you're putting your job at risk if you step out too far, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
I think part of it is there needs to be some buy-in from leadership that has the political weight to rebuff some of those um, pushes to no longer be innovative and just stop putting your cover page on your TPS report or change it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
once you get away from the bureaucracy and you have somebody who's got the weight to say, yes, we understand that the rest of the business operates this way, but this group is going to have this mandate, and the mandate is to be innovative. So that's one part of it, right? Now you have somebody who can kind of clear your path. But yeah, the other part, how to be innovative. I mean, that's a
well, I think it's a
tricky
culture
one.
thing.
It's a
I think
culture.
it's something you breed into every single employee by means of your company culture. And there are companies that are well known for being innovative that have been doing it for 50, 60, 70 years because they valued it. And there are companies that are known for being efficient. They've been doing it for 50 years.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah.
And there's some writing by Peter Sanjay, I think his name was, back in like the early 90s or something, about the two ends of the spectrum. You can be a cost-oriented strategy or an innovation-oriented strategy or a differentiation-oriented strategy. And you can make money at either ends of that spectrum, but most companies are stuck in the middle. They can't make it because they try to be both. And they suck at being both. So it's really hard. That's like age-old business strategy. Define your product portfolio, figure out who you are, and stick to your knitting. But it gets lost. Every generation that comes through thinks they can lick it and say, no, I'm going to be Tesla and I'm going to be GM. I'm going to have a mass-produced, low-price car that has no frills, and that I'm going to make this super nice, roadster that's awesome. And maybe Tesla will be able to do it. They can't. There's no way they can sustain it though for 20 years.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like one of the things that Intel, if you look at the history of Intel, they were actually big, DRAM manufacturer back in the 70s. And then the Japanese came in and were very competitive and had a lot of government subsidies, and were starting to undercut them. And so the margins in that part of the chip market started to go down. Well, it turns out Intel had a capital allocation process where it would they would essentially make decisions based on it. How high a margin is this particular product? Well, if it's higher margin, we'll put more chips in, more capital and more chips on that product. And so what happened is they started with the 4-bit. They invented, of course, the 4-bit, CPU microprocessor. Then got to an 8-bit, 80, whatever it was back then, 80, 88 or
8086.
They did not.
No, I think
Data Term did, or it was that this terminal company did, and they gave the technology
to
Intel because they couldn't manufacture it.
So the guy that I forget the fellow's name. I mean, he's sort of a famous to obviously to computer folks, but yeah. So I didn't know that. Well, in any case,
they were still the first manufacturer.
Yeah, but
if you go look at the chip, it's got Intel printed on the.
Well, they didn't take TI, and they both.
Right.
Yeah.
All those things I think were not invented by the company that ended up producing them, right?
Well, which is interesting. That's probably another subject for discussion, actually.
Yeah.
But
the x86 standard in architecture is an open standard, right? Mm-hmm. Anybody who has the ability to fabricate a microprocessor could take that standard and architect a microprocessor and fabricate it. Problem is, it's unless you're
actually, it's completely licensed by Intel.
The x86 architecture itself is an open standard. They're x86 compatible chips.
Well,
they cross-license from Intel.
I thought they reverse engineered.
They did. They reverse engineered it and got around it. Remember how they sanded off layer by layer and took photographs? That's how they made the first 8088. But they're very protective of their IP. But that's not the point. I mean, here's the rest of the.
No, but so actually there's a bunch of good questions in there, which is like open standards and innovation, what role, because that's another broadcast. But the point was that here's a big company, Intel, that's actually kind of pushed their innovation away from kind of this part of the market that they were struggling in to the part of the market that was going to grow and that had a lot of margins, just based on, apparently they didn't make a conscious decision on it. So I think that's it.
Maybe and then back to for a while, but then their own innovation strayed, and then who came up with the first 64-bit processor?
Intel, that's true.
Intel.
Yeah, that's true. Right? That's true. Good point.
They had the blockbuster thing going on. They were like, we're so great at this, the market will never change. I mean, they did a 64-bit chip, but it was a piece of shit. Yeah. And then, AMD came out and said, well, we can just add 32 more bits to this thing and make it go just like you did last time. And eventually Intel had to capitulate and do the same thing.
Yeah. So then that begs the question. So when it's tough to change big companies. They, like to your point, Randy, they get to a point where they're too big and they're too kind of stuck to routinely innovate, at least most big companies. So the idea is sometimes to spin off a separate division or operated completely independently. That's what the innovator's dilemma.
The skunkworks idea usually is required to do that.
Yeah. So how does that work today in big enterprises? What you're familiar with?
Everybody wants to be in one.
Yeah.
someone's got to shovel coal into the furnace to make the engine run too. Yeah, you end up, side of the desk innovation projects, which I thoroughly believe in, because I think
Mhm.
if you can get people to do them, it stretches out those engineering muscles that they
Mhm.
need to exercise.
Mhm.
But if, like Tom said, if your senior leadership is not in their mind thinking that 20% of people's time is going to be doing completely valueless work that is an investment in the future, then you're never going to get there. If you've got a time recording system that books every 40 hours and some customer who's watching every nickel, innovation isn't what you're doing.
Yeah.
At that point, you're just shoveling coal. You might, as long as you know it, keep doing it.
Yeah,
Tom?
you're investing in the potential, right? You're not investing in the immediate return on your investment, right? And that's where the whole ROI fallacy sort of falls apart, right? There's ROIs are good for a certain thing, right? It lets you get an idea in a very static, kind of controlled, non-dynamic way.
Yeah.
How much am I going to pay for this, and how much am I going to get back per dollar, right? But it's very hard to ROI something that doesn't have a use case. It's only got an idea, some potential, and with some loose window dressing regarding what it's capable of. But you still actually have to go do the hard work of actually finding a solution and a way to apply it that's meaningful. And that oftentimes is the hard part about innovative tools or products or things that you want to build. Is you have to find somebody who's willing to pony up the money up front with no expectation of a return on the investment, only that the investment is driving the potential of this thing that should give you an advantage or
Right.
sort of a positive outcome, right?
Right.
I think it's easy to do the ROI and innovate on incremental improvements. I'm going to save 10% on my cost of carpet next year because I'm going to buy a different kind of carpet, or use a different, whatever the hell. Those are predictable, and companies invest in those a lot, and they're worth it, and they should. The more radical ones, where I'm working on a new fundamental technology or fundamental material or something, and it's got a 4% chance of working, but the payoff is $1 jillion. Well, you better have 25 of those going so that one of them is guaranteed, statistically going to pay off. But if you're not willing to fund 25 4% projects, then you're probably not in the right business. You don't know math very well.
Right.
Yeah, law of numbers.
Well, it's interesting. So, I mean, if you think about it, so Peter Thiel wrote a book on startups called 0 to 1. And so his thesis was that there were too many, Me Too kinds of startups. And I think that feeds into what you're saying, Randy, which is, if you're going to make your business case, it's like, well, there's already, Square. So let's literally, after Square came out, there were 3 other startups with slightly different shaped, appliances, but we're essentially doing the same thing. Yeah. And so, because, frankly, it's exactly to your point, Randy, it's like, oh, there's a market. Let's go after some chunk of it.
Streaming video.
Yeah. So Thiel's point was a real startup is basically fundamentally based on a secret. So there's a shared secret among a small group of people. I think the way he put it was, what is something that you truly believe and know to be true that the rest of the world doesn't believe and doesn't know about? And that's basically the foundation for a startup. And a startup inside a company is kind of a similar thing, sort of like a new way of looking at things. What maybe was previously unknown becomes known. And how do you, that you simply can't do those kind of measurements and all the rest of it. Now, the thing is, it's interesting you brought up like that, have many of these going on, because basically that is exactly what Thiel argued. He said, if you're a venture capital firm, you have to have enough of these things with these huge returns. Like Tom said, these huge returns. And even people like Nassim Taleb, he wrote the book, The Black Swan, same kind of idea. You need to expose yourself to these unusual events, which in our case would be like extreme innovation that creates new markets, et cetera. And your chances are small, but I don't, are you guys seeing that? I mean, I don't see that. And I typically don't see that in enterprise IT. It just, or companies that, forget enterprise IT, just big companies in general.
Yeah. Occasionally what you'll see is a senior leader squirrel away some budget and kind of do one of those on his own, and 9 out of 10 times they get fired over it. It might
Okay.
take a few years before it gets discovered,
Yeah.
but ultimately there's costs getting squirreled away somewhere, or there's some special group in Detroit that no one knew about, or they get caught with somebody's daughter.
Okay. So
she spills the beans.
yeah, but let's kind of take the focus from like this big huge high level innovation, go back down to like, you're running an enterprise IT shop, and we started talking to Tom about how you make decisions. Talk to me more about what you said about procurement, which is often you're basically, you have this issue of and I think it's true for all companies, it's a set of characteristics or metrics that procurement expects. How do they figure those out? How do they decide, okay, this product meets this set of procurement, or is it just, here's our standard set of stuff and please use that because we've done all the work already?
I mean, the way that I've seen it, both here and in retail, is basically, everything is categorized, right? So if you think about a Forrester or Gartner report, and there's categories for all these different products or vendors or tools or companies, they have like a portfolio of things that they're already using that fit a given market category, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when you come along and you go, I want to get a new license for this, say that it's a vendor that they have already in their list, but you don't have a relationship with them, right? They'll look at the category of that and go, I'm going to pick on logging. You want to do like QRadar or Sumo Logic, and they already have Splunk. So they just go, nope, logging is already satisfied by Splunk. Just use Splunk. Mm-hmm. And you go, well, but there's all these other reasons why we might not want to use Splunk. And unless you have a really compelling argument, or there's a cost justification to be made for it, you'll more often than not, you'll just be told, sorry, use Splunk. That's what we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you get. Yeah. Now, sometimes there's multiple categories, multiple products in a category, because there's clear differentiations between one and the other, and they're well known throughout the industry. But I think it gets a little bit more nebulous when you're starting to talk about things that are disruptive technologies in a space, because how do you quantify and measure the value of the disruption of a new product that does something fundamentally different than the product you already have? And that's where you run into muddy waters with groups like procurement, because that's not really their job, right? They're there to protect the company against risk of excess spending, of overuse, of spreading too thin across too many vendors, too many different capabilities. And that's just talking about vendors and other companies that you might work with to buy something. That's not really even talking about like a new open source capability that has no vendor associated to it. There's no professional service contract. There's no licenses to buy. So you think about a Kafka, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kafka was starting to come around, and people are looking at it, and they're looking at how much they spend on MQ from maybe IBM, or how much going from that licensed one to Rabbit saved them money. But now there are these advantages to Kafka, and Kafka is this other thing. Nobody's really used it yet. Obviously, people are using it heavily now, but it would have been a risk for yourself to go out and develop something like that and put it into place in your product or your infrastructure without a clear understanding that this is why we're going to use this, and it doesn't have a cost, it doesn't have a support contract, so we create a little bit of risk by taking this on, but we think that the advantages that it brings to the table are significant enough to not consider going with the standard offering, right? And then that gets into a whole, but that goes right back to Randy's point about culture, right? You still need leaders in place who support that kind of culture of experimentation, looking for new things, and you have to be able to clearly articulate why this is useful, why it's good, how it's better, where you have trade-offs, and a lot of times that's the part where you end up, as the person who's maybe trying to bring innovation to the table, spend a little political capital to try and make that happen. Right? You've got some goodwill saved up over the years with your leadership, and you can say, I'm going to plunk down my own $50 here, and you guys okay with that? And so there's definitely, it's not just purely about the procurement team and their role, right? They have a role in risk reduction and cost containment and vendor sprawl, but they're not the end all be all, right? They just happen to be the stopgap for most things.
Right. At least for things that are widely used and put into production. Can you get by? Does procurement have like these? Does it make exceptions for, like, Randy? You're building something in, you're doing a homebrew, setup that might go into production someday. If actually you can build something that's interesting, but that isn't going to be put into production immediately.
There's an old saying that, show me how someone's measured and I'll predict their behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the early days, procurement teams, they were, purchasing agents, and they were set up to support the business. They kind of were order takers. They said, look, I want to buy this, go negotiate it, and we'll buy it. And they kind of did it. But they get big at a big company. Suddenly you've got thousands of vendors and literally billions of dollars in payments.
Yeah.
So suddenly it's enough to matter. And that's fine. And until someone swaggers in and gives them a target to hit. So this is the measurement part. They say, I need you, procurement, I need you to save me $100 million this year. Well, what tools does procurement have to save $100 million? They can go squeeze the vendors maybe for 1 year, but the second year they need another $100 million. It's a little harder to squeeze unless you're willing to throw somebody out.
Yeah.
So they have a huge incentive to reduce numbers or to play vendors against each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay. That's fine, I guess. I'm fine with picking your best vendors if the products are all exactly equal. But part of it is too, they want to shop at a department store instead of a local boutique. So they want to go to a company like an IBM or even as much as they may say they hate them, they really like the fact that they can buy 17 products from one company and write one check a month, because there's a fixed cost every month for every vendor that I have to deal with. So once they're given a target, they're going to use their influence any way they can to hit their target, as we all would. And you just have to decide if the target you're giving them is congruent with your company's objectives, or if it's working against your objectives. They are not a group that's incented to support innovation, right? They may have someone on their team who's the engineer that works for procurement, that goes to the, product description meetings or meets with vendors and hears about their new stuff. But in the end, the other, 39 people, their job is to squeeze money out of the existing set of payments.
Yeah.
So, so of course there's conflict there. Of course they're getting in the way and such. The beauty of the open source world is you can avoid that 100%. You don't have to deal with those people at all. You just bring it and start using it. The beauty of the cloud is that most of that stuff is wrapped up in your cloud contract. So all those different services can either be billed through your cloud provider or are a native tool that your cloud provider gives you, So log analytics, is something you can push a button and have, or in Azure, they have this thing called application insights. And I'm sure in AWS and Google and Oracle clouds, they all have these kind of basic tools that we used to look at as we need to go out and negotiate contracts for all of them. But now you take 9 out of 10 of those now, and they're all provided by your cloud provider.
Yeah.
The value is partially that you don't have to go ask anyone's permission or work through any kind of a contract to use them. You've got one contract that does it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, Oracle has these cloud credits that are, like you said, they're basically fungible. They're, you have a fixed pot of money, and it applies to any cloud service. And I think probably the other cloud providers do the same.
They have a marketplace, I'm sure, where you can buy. Like I can go if they offer Splunk as part of their cloud service, but I want to go buy someone else's thing, and it's in their marketplace, I can do that. But the billing all goes through one place, which can make it really convenient. Yeah,
absolutely. Actually, so that's a good. Go ahead, Tom.
That's a good point. The billing part is, if I'm already paying for a cloud provider, right? It's to my advantage to not have to go make an arrangement with another company to get a service or buy a product or SaaS.
If you're thinking about using licensed software in the cloud, you're doing it wrong. I mean, you either buy it from your cloud provider or you use open source. You can't go out and buy. I don't know. I'm not even going to give examples, but there's plenty of them.
Yeah,
the things do get tricky when you start working across multiple providers. So one of the challenges that our group has is we have large presences in Amazon and Azure and GCP, and different presences for each, right? Amazon is kind of our older stack of tools. Azure is more of our application stuff. GCP is more of our data stuff. If I want good, consistent, predictable, reliable monitoring, I don't necessarily want 3 different dashboards for each provider or each set of apps. I would like to have one, ideally. That's still an area that's sort of getting clarified, right? There are providers out there that
Yeah,
do
I will
single pane of glass, but
nobody sat down and said, you know what? The best way we can solve this business problem is to be in 3 different clouds, right? You got there because 3 different groups made 3 different decisions, and then somebody
right.
reorganized them into one group. There is nobody in their right mind that sits down and in this day and age and says, yeah, multi-cloud strategy is a good idea. We used
There
to
is
say
one
like that
I'd say
until
there's
someone
one
actually tried it, and then it's like you want to blow your head off when you do
there's
it.
one exception to that, and there's some so like BlackBerry recently got certified, I think, for FedRAMP. And one of the reasons that one of the things that they did in order to secure that certification was, in order to avoid an outage as a result of an entire cloud provider being down, they basically have HA cloud providers, right? So Google and Azure, because if Azure goes down, they can run all of everything in Google and vice versa. Now that's a hard challenge because it's not equal. There's a lot of parity there, but they're not equal, and you still end up supporting one stack of things, your app, your tools, but in 2 very different ways. But I agree, it's not a common problem.
Well, I mean, on the
You can insulate yourself in a lot of different ways. You can
yeah,
belts and suspenders, we used to say, but there's a limit.
yeah.
But on the other hand,
How
Andy,
And how
really
many
works,
Active Directory outages have there been in Azure in the last 6 months?
but I have to push back on that a little bit, right? I mean, if I'm going to run a big Microsoft estate, I'm big complex Microsoft estate. I prefer to have Microsoft run that for me. And if I'm a developer, I mean, Amazon won the developer war. I mean, that's where, developers use that. So a lot of times what I see in my day to day is the developers are driving what companies are doing. They like AWS. They have good reasons for that. So I mean, come on, can't you smart IT guys manage? It's just like my dog's getting excited here. Can't you smart IT guys manage multiple clouds? Away.
We can. It just takes a lot more work.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, the cloud vendors, though, are not doing anything different that's been done in the IT world for the last 40 years, which is, how do I create lock-in for my customers?
Right.
So they do, right? And when you use their services, their cloud native services, you are locked in. And there was the promise of something like Terraform, where you could deploy to multi-clouds using the same code. It turns out, no, you can't. You got to rewrite it for every cloud you go into. You get close. But if you do anything more than just build servers and make networks,
I think
you're going to have to find parity.
I think it's even worse than that, because basically, I mean, I agree with you, but I mean, if you look at certain cloud vendors, I won't name specific cloud vendors, but I mean, literally, they will take an open source kind of product, and then they will, essentially make it into their own custom API, or they'll have their own internal APIs that literally can run nowhere else on the planet, right? So only in their cloud. And that just seems insane. It's more lock-in than you got with a mainframe. At least with a mainframe, you could get other mainframes from other hardware manufacturers, and you could, or you could run open source software. You can run it in different locations. Oh yeah.
In the old days, there was a Hitachi, or there was a Fujitsu or someone, but I don't know if any of those are still making mainframes. But
yeah,
I hear what you're saying, though.
No, but it's like I said, you're absolutely right. Which is the lock-in and cloud on a lot of these, quite a bit of cloud technology is really probably the most it's ever been in the industry.
I would even go so far as to say that a lot of
server, I can get Postgres, I can get a network.
Say again. Sorry.
Go ahead, Randy.
I was going to say, you can get the basics. You can get a network. You can get a Postgres server. You can get Kafka. You can deploy all that yourself. But if you're doing all that, you're not really getting the benefit of the cloud. You're still building widgets, and you better be damn good at it, because the reality is the people that know how to build those widgets are few and far between at scale with reliability prepared to push the button and get a multi-region database that's, eventually consistent, without knowing that it's been built to a standard and has the engineering talent behind it to back it up if it fails.
So the question is,
especially if you're a small company.
Yeah. So that's a great point. So where is that build versus buy when you're leveraging, really interesting open source components, right? Because sometimes you can just consume them, or maybe it's that they're easier. That you find them, a particular open source component is just pretty easy to just integrate into what you're doing, like Linux ended up being relatively straightforward to integrate. There are other. I mean, how do you, kind of when do you? Because I know, for example, you guys leverage open source databases as well as Oracle. So how do you kind of make those deployment decisions? Where obviously Oracle's obviously the more expensive, sort of from a list price sort of choice, but how do you decide when you deploy one versus the other?
I mean, who cares what we decided 5 years ago? Those things are all in place and they're going to be running for 10 more years, right? But if we have a new thing today, how do we decide what to use is really the question.
Yeah.
And it's driven partly by cost, although everyone agrees that, there's an investment to using open source beyond the free software. You have to engineer it. But a lot of it also is lock-in. We've done replatforming enough times, and it pisses us off every time we have to do it. And you're either doing it for a cost reason, or for a capability reason, or for a quality reason. We've kicked every software vendor out and brought them all in at one point or another, right? They've all been on the ugly end of that transaction at some point. So the answer is, at any point in time, you evaluate what your options are, and it depends. Right now, our kind of corporate dogma is to view open source first, and if you feel you're going to scale beyond that, or you have a critical need, you can look at something else. But there's very few that can't. Where we run into problems is when someone tends to over-engineer the requirements. These are great all the time. It's like, well, I need multi-region, super consistency, at faster than the speed of light. And people say, well, do you really? And then they find out, well, no, I'm really just running a single promotion for, nicotine patches or something like that, for Windy Thursdays in Lent for 3 more years. It's not really that big of a deal. But people will do things. Well, they'll say, I need my data system to have item level ACLs, that are tied into a global system of authorization. And then you find out, well, who's going to keep track of all that? They say, well, I don't know. They just, I read it in a book that's a good thing. And so they tend to over-engineer their requirements, and then you end up with these obscure, weird, literally cutting edge vendors out there that are 3 days from their first A-level offering, and that's dangerous. I think people you can do a lot with existing technology, and very rarely should you have to veer off that path unless you're doing something really profound, which you should be doing, but there's not a lot of those. Not every project is profound. It's not like Bubblegum.
I see. But you all, yeah, that's okay. But so if you go with that route, how do you make sure you have the staffing to really, to your earlier point, can manage, when your app is kind of hitting a boundary with an open source component? How do you're going to have enough expertise. You're going to have to hire that expertise. You're going to have to change the workload. How do you guys deal with that on a day-to-day basis? Or you're just saying it doesn't happen very often?
Oh, I was thinking something witty to say, but I thought maybe I should.
Go ahead.
I keep it all to myself so they can never fire me.
I just don't want you to get fired. I just don't want you to get fired. That's the main thing.
As
you
a
can talk
hiring
about at
manager,
another. You could say at another company.
Yeah. No,
as a hiring manager, there are certain
that's
traits I
tricky.
look for.
It's tricky because you do projects and you bring in your best people and they set it all up and then they leave. I mean, this is like what Ernst & Young has been doing for people for years, right? I'm going to bring in my $400 an hour consultants that have been doing this for 15 years and they're going to engineer something and get you going. And lo and behold, but they have the right in their contract to replace resources as needed. And, 3 months into it, you look around and you're looking at all new faces and they've all been handed off a set of documentation to take the next steps on your project or do your thing.
Okay.
And I think that's what happens in IT shops. Companies have their kind of core go-to people, and if you're lucky enough to get invited to one of those parties, it's great because you learn really fast from all those nerds that do this really well. But ultimately, there's a finite number of those, and they don't tend to stick around a long time. And sometimes those projects burn down bad, and the original people aren't there to take the heat for it. It's
I see. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Sometimes that's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tom,
I don't know, Tom,
you were
what do you
saying?
think? You
I
got the
look for it
same
when I'm
point of view?
in the hiring process. I'm looking for specific key traits, right? Not everybody comes through a hiring process. Sometimes you inherit a team, or you're just on a team that's been a stable size, and you're not adding people. So then it comes down to can you teach some of those traits if people don't have them, right? Curiosity, self-learning, having a sense of urgency, but not being overwhelmed by it, right? So many times there have been people who have great ideas, brilliant, thinking. They come up with great things, but then they just don't execute on it.
Mm-hmm.
Or they can knock out 100 tasks a day, but they're not thinking for themselves with regard to why or how it could be better, or a system could be built more efficiently. And so there's certain personality traits I look for and try and instill within my team around how to go about these things and how to think about them, but then also actually just taking the time to get it done, right? I mean, there's the whole GSD thing. At the end of the day, you got to fish. You can't just sit around and cut bait all the time, pondering about the infinite possibilities and the great potential of all the world's innovative products. You just actually have to do something. And so it's sort of a combination of like being curious, being able to go surround yourself with knowledge, and then apply it. Yep. Right. If you can do those three things, it almost doesn't matter what you're going to be working on. Right. It's obviously certain things are going to be outside of your skill set. Right. If you're coming from a DevOps background and you're suddenly thrust into a data science organization, obviously present company excluded, you might feel a little overwhelmed. But outside of that, like there are kind of common behavioral and personality traits that lend themselves to being able to do these things at a higher level. And I think you'll find that those are common traits when you go find those teams that Randy's talking about, the sort of the nerd collective that exists inside of every organization, and who are who are really the real ones versus, kind of everybody else who's just sort of on the periphery supporting, it's their job. There's nothing wrong with that, but they're not like the big brains in the room that are solving significant problems and creating real new innovative ideas and thoughts and solutions.
Think
Not
about
that
it.
the other guys are always doing that either, but there's certainly more potential there to have it manifest itself.
And the great point you made is, can you train some of these traits? And I would say yes, or people. I think maybe it's more people tend to train themselves. The ones that are curious are not. They find themselves maybe jumping into a shit show year after year and coming out smelling good because they learned how to diagnose and solve problems. Where I've met many people that are late in their careers that just don't even know fundamental troubleshooting skills, or problem solving skills, which I don't even necessarily think are IT centric. They're just how do you go about solving a problem?
Right.
And you learn those skills by flexing those muscles, by doing it and being forced to do it. So it's almost, you just need to, if someone needs to learn those things, you need to toss them into an environment where they're completely out of their league and completely underwater, and let them swim. Let them learn to swim.
Yeah. The old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. Right. I mean, how often have these
fire people for failing if you do that, though? If you're an organization that when people fail, you just fire them and move on to the next person, well, then no one's going to want to be taking any risks. No one's going to want to jump in and save those organizations or solve those problems, right? There's just too much risk. I'd much rather make TPS repair if you're going to fire me.
Back to your original point, Randy, about culture, really, and being like you said, tolerating failures. Yeah, very good. Well, hey, I know we got a little bit of a late start, but I want to kind of keep these roughly on schedule. So why don't we? I have a suggestion. I think we had a couple of interesting themes here, including personnel training and hiring for innovation. I also think there's a broader theme that was sort of threaded through this was, open source. To your point, Randy, because of its accessibility, is one reason it took off. There's other reasons, of course, but just being able to go, just get it and use it and learn from the community that's developing it, that was very powerful and continues to be powerful. Then you have cloud, which had a similar kind of accessibility, and cloud has probably exceeded the sort of ease of use and accessibility of open source. I mean, some people have been arguing, in the, bloggers, et cetera, have been arguing that cloud is kind of overtaking open source in terms of that sort of aspect. So why don't let's regather and we'll do another this is the first broadcast ever. So we're sort of working out the kinks a little bit, but if you guys are willing to come on board for one more, let's follow up with those two themes. Any final comments or words or thoughts based on kind of what we've been talking about? Any profound wisdom you want to impart?
Don't shit where you eat. I hope that's okay to say on this podcast.
Well, you can say it on YouTube, but then they demonetize you if you use naughty words. So, but anyway,
I'm sure you can figure out a creative bleep, man.
Oh no, people, yeah, I can bleep it out, but actually it's live. So anyway, that's okay. We don't care about monetization. We care about innovation. So
that's
cool.
Right.
All right.
Sometimes innovators swear.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I really appreciate you guys jumping on board. I learned quite a bit. It was very interesting. My dog's attacking me now for attention. But I'm going to end the broadcast. And again, thanks to anyone who joined us. And I'll see if I can fight off my dog. So hold on. I'll end the broadcast.
Thanks, guys.